We are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Father Roy Bourgeois. Father Roy Bourgeois is founder of the School of the Americas Watch, which works to close the School of the Americas and actively challenges U.S. militarism in Latin America. In addition to that, in the past year, Father Roy and the SOAW movement protested at the gates of a U.S. military base in Colombia, met in Venezuela with activists from 19 Latin American countries to strategize a response to militarism and to build a culture of peace, and participated in the Social Forum of the Americas in Paraguay. So maybe start out and tell us a bit about the School of the Americas.
Yeah, well, it took me a while to get involved in Latin America. This is a school that trains every year about 1,000 soldiers from 15 countries of Latin America, Central America. But it also took me a while to connect to this issue. I come from a military background, 4 years in the military, thought of making it a career, a Vietnam vet, and like so many of us, was changed by that, the madness of that war in Vietnam, as many of us are, of course, changing our views on what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the world. We are changed by experiences and highly influenced and inspired at times by, peacemakers who we meet along the way. But most of all, I think for me and for many, we are changed by those who are the victims who are on the receiving end of our U.S. foreign policy. And really, it was in Vietnam when I first started to question my country's foreign policy. I thought our cause was a noble one. We were the good guys, as they always referred to us, and we were going to bring democracy, and we were going to be the liberators, and it sounded so good. But looking back, it was all a big lie that I and so many bought into. We bought into that evil as good. And I had my, this awakening in a sense, but it was just the beginning. And it came later, further down the road when I became a Catholic priest and then assigned to work with the poor of Bolivia, that I really got educated about, it was U.S. Foreign Policy 101 through the eyes of the poor. And as I lived, during those 5 years in this barrio of Bolivia, La Paz, Bolivia, working with the poor, they became my teachers and really helped me see foreign policy through their eyes. And we were supporting brutal dictator General Bonza, one of the many that we were supporting. There was Pinochet in Chile. There were the thugs in Central America. Put simply, we were on the wrong side. We were giving guns and training to those soldiers, protecting that very, very tiny economic elite in their countries, exploiting the poor, their cheap labor. And of course, we were there exploiting the vast natural resources. In my 5th year, I was kicked out of Bolivia, arrested along with many, many. And one of the fortunate in that I was expelled. I was not killed. And because I was a gringo and had a passport, they kicked me out of the country. Got very involved then in El Salvador with a lot of us. We went there after the assassination of Bishop Oscar Romero, the rape and murder of 4 U.S. churchwomen, 3 nuns and a lay worker who went there to help Bishop Romero. 2 of them were good friends with the Marino sisters, Maura Clark and Ida Ford. And that brought us to El Salvador, Mike, and what we found there, once again, was our country deeply involved, giving training to those doing the killing, at war with their people. And then what we found out just shortly thereafter, that those who killed Bishop Romero, the churchwomen, those who killed 6 Jesuit priests in 1989, along with their 2 women co-workers, were trained at Fort Benning down in Georgia at the U.S. Army School of the Americas. And I and a small group who had worked in Latin America, in Bolivia, El Salvador, and other countries, we went down to investigate this U.S. Army School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia. And what we found was a school of assassins, as it became known in these countries of Latin America. And we went to work, simply doing research through the Freedom of Information Act. We got, in the early days, a few members of Congress like Joe Kennedy from Massachusetts and others to help us with our investigation. And what we found was a school, really, that was connected to untold suffering and death in Latin America. It had trained at that time over 50,000 military personnel from these 15 countries, all financed, of course, with our tax money, millions of dollars still being pumped into this school of assassins. But something happened. We started our website, opened up a little office in Washington, D.C., and went to work. We educated ourselves, the media, the U.S. public, and we had to also educate our members of Congress. They knew nothing about this school that had been operating behind this wall of secrecy. And we started gathering at the main gate of Fort Benning every November, simply to keep alive the memories of the tens of thousands who were killed by these soldiers going back to their home countries that we had trained. The courses there were not complicated. It was about counterinsurgency, commando operations. The counterinsurgents, of course, were the poor. They were seen as el enemigo, the enemy. They were those in El Salvador and these countries who couldn't make it on $1 a day, whose kids were living, day to day, who died before the age of 5. There was few schools, little health care, and, people who live under such conditions of oppression and suffering. What's going on in these countries, of course, in the Middle East and in Libya, there comes a point where you can just oppress and make people suffer so much, and people will start organizing as they did in El Salvador, Bolivia, and all of these countries that we're reading about now. They begin to say, basta, enough. No. We can no longer live like this. They get organized, and that movement, that revolution, that uprising comes, of course, from the oppressed, who make up the majority of the population. And these dictators like Gaddafi, the thugs we supported in Central America and throughout Latin America, they will not, out of the goodness of their heart, give up their power and their wealth and all of their privileges, their lifestyle. It doesn't work that way. And they are forced by the poor, the oppressed, who make up, again, the majority of these countries, who push back. And this is what's going on now throughout Latin America. There is a sea change, I must say. But let me just say, we started with a small group. Now when we gather in November, there are thousands. Our numbers grew to 15,000, 20,000. When we look at this sea of people gathered at the main gate of Fort Benning every November, it's usually the weekend before Thanksgiving, to call for the closing of the school. Many from, the Puget Sound, from Seattle to the state of Washington have been with us. There's a very active group here in Seattle who have, became a part of our movement in the early days and continue to work very hard. We have in our movement now, I would say half who gather would be college students, high school students, a lot of military veterans, nuns, labor leaders, labor people from the unions come because of Colombia. Most of the soldiers trained here are from Colombia, the country where there are more labor leaders killed than any other country in the world, where we are pumping about $1 billion a year into this country, Colombia. And it has become, as a result of our encuentro, our meeting just recently, bringing together our counterparts from some 20 countries in Latin America, Honduras, where there was a military coup 2 years ago, where the two main players of that coup, the top generals, the head of the Army and the Air Force, of course, graduates of the school. Colombia is a high priority for us right now because of the buildup of 7 U.S. military bases in the country, which is really destabilizing the region. But let me just say, too, we find a lot of hope, Mike. We have, over the last few years, a delegation has been put together representing the SOA Watch movement, grassroots movement, calling for the closing of this school. We've gone to, now it's about 15 countries. We've met with 6 presidents, defense ministers, indigenous leaders, and we've called on them to pull their troops out. And I'm happy to report, after meeting with some of these presidents and defense ministers and others, 4 countries have done just that. They've severed their ties to the school. Those countries, Argentina, Uruguay, Venezuela, and I'm very happy to say Bolivia. Let's just for a moment look at Bolivia, because it's sort of a symbol of what's going on in Latin America, this sea change taking place. I was expelled from there years ago. The jails were filled up with political prisoners for speaking out against the dictatorship that we supported. Today, there's President Evo Morales in a country where the majority are indigenous. He is the first ever indigenous president. And I must say, the meeting with him just reminded me that we just never know. But I felt such hope in that meeting and what we heard. And it's sort of not in every country, but you can see this evolving in so many countries, not only in Latin America and Central America, throughout the world. People are saying, no, we cannot live like this. We have enough resources in our country that we don't have to live under such difficult conditions. We can have schools. We can have a living wage. We can have hospitals and clinics to bring our children to when they're sick. We don't have to live in fear from these dictators and thugs, And what we heard, too, was very alarming because they said to us, as from citizens from the U.S., that our country was welcome, but not as before. We have been the conquistadors. We have gone in to exploit, to enrich ourselves from that cheap labor and, again, those vast resources. And President Morales said to us that our country, and we hear this in other countries that we visited, we are welcome as a country, but no, come on, it's not as before. Not as the empire, as they refer to us, to live off of them, to enrich ourselves off of their blood and sweat. And that's the question I ask, Mike, many of us, are we capable of going into these countries, as President Morales said, as a partner, to work with him and these other leaders of these countries and the poor to improve the quality of life in these countries? Can we go and be a part of that movement that's really taking root? I want to believe we can, but I don't know. We're going to Washington April 4th through the 11th. We want to get President Obama's attention. I must say we're disappointed, as many are. We thought that when he became president, we would have Latin America back on the radar screen. And we would have apologies made to these countries for what we have done to them over the years. All that suffering and death and oppression could not have been done with our support and our tax money, of course, who pumped the billions into these countries over the years. All of this death and suffering could not have been done without the United States. And there are apologies that must be made. And they are waiting for this apology. And we're hoping we can get President Obama to start looking at what happened and our role in Latin America and apologize. We're going to be in Washington April 4th through the 11th. We're going to be in front of the White House on a liquid fast. We're not going to eat for a week. And also, we're going to have a lot of folks lobbying, knocking on congressional doors. We're asking President Obama to close down this school in Georgia, well known as the School of Assassins, to shut it down by executive order. He can do it, line item veto. He has that power. And we hope to eventually get a meeting with him. That Sunday, I think it's the 10th, when we end our fast, we're going to have a mass action, a huge sit-in of hundreds in front of the White House. I invite, folks from the area here to look at the calendar and come down for, the week or for a day or two to be present with us. For more information on this issue and our presence in Washington, you can just go to our website, soaw.org, soaw.org.
So I believe it was on Obama's watch when the recent coup in Honduras occurred, so that kind of indicates
Exactly.
their stance on Latin America. In addition to training of militaries in Central and South America at Fort Benning, isn't Fort Benning also involved with training of military personnel in other countries, for instance, let's say the Middle East?
I'm glad you bring this up. This is very important. I must say there is another school at Fort Benning called the International School, We have trained soldiers there from throughout the world, many from Egypt, African nations, Indonesia, the Philippines. Many Israelis are trained here. This is a school we've really got to do more research on and get more information about because it is serious. We've been very focused on the School of the Americas that trains soldiers coming in. To date, over 65,000 have been trained here, continue to train about 1,000 a year, again, all with our tax money. And in the midst of these budget cuts to schools here and wherever I travel in Georgia, they're making serious budget cuts to schools. And, this is a scandal. Every dollar that's being cut from health care and from our schools, our colleges, that is a theft. But we have millions to pump into this military school. But actually, we just got in touch with our friend Amy Goodman, at Democracy Now!, and we're reaching out. I just called the Atlanta Constitution, the paper, the large paper nearby in Atlanta. But we want some attention to what you just asked and brought up, this international school, where there are soldiers being trained from all over the world. We do have a list, actually, I've met with a couple of retired personnel there, like Major Joe Blair from Georgia, 20 years in the military, a big supporter of our cause. But he was briefing me on, there are Egyptians there. Over the years, we have pumped, as we know, billions of dollars into Egypt. And they have a lot of our planes, those fighter planes, the F-16s, lots of tanks, lots of M-16s and other military hardware. That, needless to say, we are arming the world. And it's coming back to haunt us, It's blowback time. It's a time now, our friends of the past have now become, the enemies of the people. And one thing that people in Latin America and Egypt and all of these other countries know. They know, for example, one of the things that I thought was so important, that connection, when the uprising began in Egypt, Cairo, and they were dispersed by hundreds of these tear gas canisters. And I'll never forget that one of the reporters there picked up that canister. And the people, of course, are, they're weeping, they're dispersing. It's a very serious thing here. But he picked up that canister and it said, "Made in the USA." And it's very significant because he did say that the majority of the people in Egypt know that their country, their military, has been supplied with these canisters, supplied with these tanks, with these planes. And as in, of course, Libya. Now, a lot of the military there are mercenaries. Libya's a little unique in that they didn't bring, we're trying to get some research done on Libya, but unlike Egypt, many of the military of these countries have trained at the international school. And this is very important. We're trying to get some journalists to really make that connection. We have not seen that to date. And we think this is something very important that they're leaving out. We know that, Gaddafi and Mubarak and many others have been our so-called friends, allies. We, for many, many years, simply looked the other way. We didn't talk about democracy and human rights. Now, all of a sudden, because they see the writing on the wall, they see the reality, and the reality is the people are uprising. They are saying, enough. We are not going to take this anymore. And now, because they know that we are on the losing side, that the people will be victorious. And we've got a lot of interest there. So all of a sudden now, the people who we helped oppress because of supporting their dictators, all of a sudden now we are trying to portray ourselves as a friend of the pueblo, as a friend of the poor. But we've got a lot of work to be done, needless to say, a lot of apologizing to do. It's going to take more than words, of course, to repair the damage. And I just want to, when we travel through these countries in Latin America, they want an apology. They want the truth, is what they say to us. The thousands who are still disappeared, the many, many who have been tortured, they want their militaries to go to trial and take responsibility and acknowledge, they say, their wrongdoing. And they also want the United States to own up to what we have done, in their struggle, what we have done in support of their dictators for all those years. And of course, we are not supporting these military trials in these countries because what's going to happen, the truth will surface. But what's very important, I think, is for us, to really be honest and to speak the truth and to acknowledge what we have done in these countries and to apologize. Now, they say to us, and we know that, closing this School of the Americas, now called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, they're trying to put a new face on it. They say that they're teaching democracy now. Well, and many in our movement, we're in the military. You do not learn democracy in the military. You don't learn democracy behind the barrel of a gun. But one thing that they, again, want is for our country to apologize. And by closing this school down in Georgia, still known as the School of the Americas or School of Assassins, School for Dictators, closing it would send an important message that the United States is going to separate itself from the past. I mean, it's a beginning, a humble beginning, that we are going to distance ourselves from your militaries that we have supported. Today in Latin America and in these countries, you don't need men with guns. You don't need more tanks. They have more than enough of our fighter planes, tanks, commandos that we've trained. What they need, they're saying to us, we need schools. Can you help build them? We need clinics and hospitals. Can you help us build them? We need agronomists. Can you help us with our, crops? We need, aid that will improve the quality of life here. We do not need your guns. And so this is a message, I think, what I've learned is that we all have a voice. Like Bishop Oscar Romero said in El Salvador before he was assassinated by graduates of this school we're trying to shut down. He said, let those who have a voice speak out for justice. Speak out and work for peace. That's where we come in. We have a voice. We have a voice. And some of us with powerful voices, like bishops in the church. Wow. The most silent group I know throughout Latin America, with the exception of people like Bishop Romero and a few other, they were in the minority. But many of our so-called spiritual leaders, church leaders and others who have such powerful voices, their voices for many, many years and today continue to be silent. And that silence, as we know, is the voice of complicity. Our silence, when we see this suffering and this injustice in our foreign policy and what it's doing, our silence is the voice of consent. And that's why I encourage our listeners, to speak out on this issue and all these, what's going on, of course, in the Middle East and in Libya. We have a voice, and we should let our president, our members of Congress know how we feel about this, what's going on in the world today, and all of this militarism that we have become addicted to.
You have recently gotten in trouble with the Vatican, but it's not over your work against militarism. Can you talk about that briefly?
No, real briefly, Mike. Yeah, in addressing this injustice of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, Central America, I discovered an injustice much closer to home in my church. I'm a Catholic priest. I've been a priest with the Maryknoll Order for 38 years now. And I continue to receive a lot of good support from my Maryknoll community, my brothers in the community, and it means a lot. Now, but here's what happened in my my 20 years of working on the School of the Americas issue, I met very many talks in many churches and colleges. Anyways, I met many devout Catholic women who shared with me their faith and said they are also being called by God, as we are as men, they are being called as women to be priests in the Catholic Church. Well, they are rejected. The Catholic Church teaches that only baptized men can be priests. Well, I had to do some serious thinking about this, reflecting. We had never questioned that teaching in the seminary. It was always the tradition. As in growing up in this little town in Louisiana, it was our tradition to have separate schools, segregated schools. It was the tradition. And what I've discovered, Mike, is not heavy theology here. This teaching is rooted in sexism, as the school system was rooted in racism in the South. And what we have here is a grave injustice against women, a grave injustice against our church, and a grave injustice against our God that we believe in, who calls both men and women to the priesthood. As Catholics, we say it this way, that we are created of equal worth and dignity, that we are all in the image and likeness of our Creator. And so the question I'm asking the Vatican, and of course my fellow priest, who are we to say that our call from God is authentic, but your call as women is not? Who are we to reject God's call of women to the priesthood? And what we have here again is a grave injustice, and I couldn't be silent on this injustice so close to home. And so I went public. Of course, I had to break my silence, and also attended the ordination of one of the many women called to the priesthood who was ordained not long ago. And it was after attending and many, talks I give now on women's ordination. I received a letter from the Vatican, a very serious letter, giving me 30 days to recant my belief in public statements calling for the ordination of women, or I will be excommunicated, what they call late sententiae, automatically. So I wrote back to the Vatican my response saying, in conscience, I cannot and will not recant. I have not received any word from any response from my letter, so I'm continuing in my work. I will continue to speak out against this injustice of excluding women from the priesthood. And so the struggle continues. There's also a website for that. It's Women's Ordination Conference.org or Roman Catholic Women Priests.org, and where listeners can find out more about this movement that is unstoppable. It's like the women's suffrage movement, the abolition of slavery, civil rights movement. This is a movement rooted in justice that simply cannot be stopped.
All right. How can people find out more about the School of America's Watch?
Yes, they can simply, go to our website. They can go to soaw.org to find out more information about our lobbying efforts, the vigil. We're going to Honduras, also very important. We're going to Honduras the first week of May. We need more people on that delegation. If you're interested, just contact the national office, 202-234-3440, or you can also, get more information on that delegation to Honduras by going to the website soaw.org.
All right. Well, with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you, Mike.